It's time for the Bible Geek.
Robert M. Christ. We don't really know for sure what is and what is not.
Holy Ghost.
God, fantastic. God blasted my spine.
Ghost.
Yes, friends, it's time for the Bible Geek. Interpretation. Startle. Jesus. Homiletical. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Well, it's St. Paddy's Day, and of course that means it's time for the Bible Geek. I have threatened to do the whole show in this voice, but I guess I'll have mercy on you, and just go back to me old boring voice, unless, of course, there's an Irish questioner, but I doubt that. Okay, I think this one is from Frank Glomset. This is one of those things where I'm missing a name somewhere, and I'm not sure if the one I have is for the preceding or the following. So I think it's Frank. In your Bible Geek podcast of 18th July, there was a question about who got crucified in Matthew and Mark. I have a creative, heretic-style solution. The Gospel of Mark is a cleverly devised myth, probably what 2 Peter was talking about. We did not follow cleverly devised myths, quote-unquote, when the church began to historicize this fairy tale and pretend that all the Gospels were talking about the same thing. But Mark wasn't fooling anyone. He just tried to keep outsiders on the outside with his parables or riddles. There's no point of secrecy, as in a mystery religion, if everything is in the open for everybody all the time, right? Mark and his sect could choose their insiders and explain to the more sophisticated readers about the good news. Since everything is aimed at the reader, Mark is probably trying to teach or show the reader something when he has Jesus give Simon Peter, James, and John ironic nicknames, give them private time, and let them witness the greatness so they could have the best faith ever, and still they fall. Even God breaks into the narrative and tells them to listen. The disciples are portrayed as so stupid that they just have to pay for their stupidity at the end, if there ever is any good news in there at all. Their lack of faith sure is a main point in Mark, for instance, 4:4. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? So who's got faith? If faith can move mountains, the question, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb, should be answered by someone with faith. I believe Mark has Simon Peter crucified instead of Jesus, with James and John on his left and right. I don't think there is enough reason to nail these three to the cross, but sometimes it's the thought that counts. Mark 1:16-20 says Jesus called Simon Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Mark 1:29-31 says the same four are present when Jesus does his first miracle. Mark 13, again, the same four are alone with Jesus when he tells them what's about to happen soon. Jesus' message, don't sleep, be awake, keep watch. So after the disciples ate and drank some Jesus, it sounds like Michael Jackson somehow. Everything is set for Gethsemane. The three main disciples sleep like they never have slept before, ignoring Jesus' plea to stay awake. Only Andrew could be awake and keep watch, right? Because Andrew is the naked young man fleeing away in Gethsemane and reappears at the tomb. Judas enters the scene and the action starts. Even though Andrew was warned and awake, he only escapes by the skin of his teeth, naked. This just has to be a sign to the reader, which tells him that all the other disciples certainly did not escape. They were seized and taken in along with Jesus. That's why Simon Peter is depicted as following at a distance and entering the courtyard and sitting with the guards and warming himself at the fire. He's not brave. Then Mark had some fun with Barabbas and Simon of Cyrene, so much fun that our Jesus gets away, just as he conveniently begged for in Gethsemane, 14:35 through 36. Later, the women fled from the tomb and said nothing to anyone. That's not strange, considering that the women were present at the crucifixion. They saw exactly who was crucified. So when Andrew instructs the women to go and tell Peter and the other disciples, it's just too much for them. 13:26 to 27. At that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. The reader will see Andrew, Son of Man, Andreas, Greek word for man, send the women, the angels, and gather the readers, the elected, the insiders that get it. So the reader will see Andrew, the Son of Man, send the women who are the angels and gather the readers. Yeah, that makes sense. I'm not saying this is the answer, but why are things like this even possible to twist out of the text? Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I've done that too, to say what possible readings could the text bear, and what seems weird to us may not have to the ancients. And there is this ancient discussion of who was really crucified. Was it Judas? Was it Pilate? Was it Satan? I mean, Muslim exegetes are still going at that hundreds of years later. Interesting possibility. Some folks would write a book about this. So, Frank, there may be your entree to big-time New Testament scholarship. Think about it some more. Fascinating. Okay, now I'm not sure who wrote this one again. I think I have lost the name, but you know who you are. What are our sources for the story that Antiochus Epiphanes forbade Hebrew worship? Do we have anything substantive beyond the Book of Maccabees or Josephus, who himself was probably echoing Macabees? I've tried looking for sources, and I keep being directed to Maccabees or Josephus, as if these constitute any kind of authentic critical history. Even assuming there is a reflection of history in them, it would be from a sectarian, partisan viewpoint. I ask this because I was recently at a Hanukkah celebration when the rabbi repeated the story about Antiochus forbidding Jewish worship, and suddenly something in me went, wait a minute, this doesn't sound like Greek Hellenistic practice at all. I'm not saying that a Hellenistic ruler couldn't a priori forbid a people their worship, just that it sounds strange in the cosmopolitan context of the Alexandrian Empire, which seemed to have no problem with all kinds of gods and worships. It seemed in that moment to me much more likely that this was, so to speak, a right-wing religious reaction against perhaps some decree of Antiochus, who knows, perhaps one that merely liberally permitted Jerusalem to worship whomever they chose, as amounting to forbidding their religion, and then turning amounting into actually forbidding. We can see modern-day fundamentalists interpreting any more pluralistic embrace of other religions as somehow discriminating against their religion. The national chauvinists who wrote Maccabees don't seem too far from this kind of fundamentalist or puritanical approach. By the way, to break in, I do take this approach to the story of Paul as a persecutor of the church. I think there's been unwitting reinterpretation from a sectarian viewpoint that transformed the original notion of the Ebionites that Paul had opposed and therefore, quote, persecuted, unquote, real Christianity, their legalistic Christianity, and that later on people heard that and said, what's that? Paul persecuted Christians? And so on. Okay, But if it's authentic history, I'll accept it as such. I'd just like to see some primary sources, like some sort of reference to the decree in some reputable historical source. Do we have such? Or are we simply supposed to accept Maccabees and Josephus at their word? Well, generally speaking, I think we're kind of stuck with these sources because we don't know any better. And I'm not sure if this business really makes them that suspect. I mean, sometimes you can kind of discern a partisan slant, but generally speaking, I think they're probably pretty reliable. But the thing with the violation of the general tolerant mood of Hellenism, that is interesting. But keep in mind, Antiochus is depicted as a kind of a paranoid with delusions of grandeur, and that he wasn't just trying to stamp out Judaism. His real goal was to convert all Jews to the worship of Antiochus Epiphanes as Zeus on earth. And there's probably nothing a guy like this won't do. And so the megalomania of the individual, I think, can overbalance the general tolerant mood of the culture. In fact, later on, I forget whether it was Hadrian or Trajan, one of the emperors forbade circumcision, and this is really no different from that, and that seems to be pretty historically based. So I don't really have a problem with that, but you never know. Okay, this from David F. I would like to get your take on Dr. James Mickey Effird's, E-F-I-R-D, his writings on Revelation and apocalyptic literature, specifically Revelation for Today. Excuse me. I'm not sure if that's a broadcast or a book. But anyway, Bruce Metzger has a more recent book, Breaking the Code, that appears to be very similar. Of course, Metzger is dead many years now, but there is a publication in 2006 of his book, Breaking the Code, which is about interpreting Revelation. Okay, do you agree with their views that, by the way, I've never heard of the first gent, and let's see, I've not read this Metzger book. Do you agree with their views that Revelation was not about the end of the world, but simply a book written in a well-known genre for that day to give people hope that their persecution under the Emperor Domitian would soon be over if they just waited it out? That seems to me to be an artificial distinction. Like, what is the basis for comforting those poor people if it's not that, look, don't worry, he who endures to the end shall be saved, that soon Christ is going to come and kick this guy's butt? I mean, I don't know how you could say, oh, well, no, it's not really about the end of the world. It's about what? I mean, what is the hope of deliverance otherwise? Are we going to start saying, well, this apocalyptic doomsaying was really just a way of saying that things will get better? In fact, this reminds me of a scene I think I've mentioned before in this incredibly awful but fascinating old movie from 1963 or something, William Castle's movie, The 13 Ghosts, where it's almost like a sitcom, but it doesn't seem to realize it, where these people move into a house that has been willed to them by an uncle or something, and they're in great penury, and so they're glad to move right in. But it turns out that the guy, Dr. Plato Zorba, that he, by the way, this would make a great board game. But at any rate, he was a psychic researcher and had somehow, a la the Ghostbusters, but 20 years before, managed to capture 12 ghosts, though there is a 13th whose identity you discover later. And they begin raising hell in the house. Now, the new occupants don't believe in ghosts at first, but weird things start to happen, and the mom is in the kitchen preparing dinner, and suddenly, out of nowhere, a meat cleaver materializes and flies into the wall, just missing her head, and thunk into the wood it goes. And just like on Chopped, if you've ever seen that on the food porn channel. And she's naturally hysterical. And her husband comes in, "What's the matter?" And she explains what happened. And he says, "Things'll calm down." A meat axe just flew from nowhere within an inch of your wife's head, and all he can say is, "Things'll calm down." Well, is that all Revelation is saying? It seems to me a very contrived, transparent attempt to sidestep the gross embarrassment of the predictions of Revelation not coming true. So if that's what they say, I think it's ridiculous. Okay, here's one from Joshua. If I can read this, I'm having real trouble with these glasses. Barchinger. This is interesting. He says, "I'm studying history with a focus on early Christian history and have a question. I was looking over some ideas a friend and I had a few years ago. He has a PhD in chemistry but was in a history mood at the time. He came away with the idea that Mark, Matthew, and Luke certainly weren't written before 100 CE or AD, and that the Gospels of Marcion, Peter, and James had priority over all of them. He ended up getting a teaching position, and we were never able to discuss this more in depth, so I'm wanting to ask your opinion. I do not necessarily agree that Marcion, Peter, and James come before Mark. He wasn't 100% convinced of this either, but it was the position he had at the time. But I do think that it is possible that they came before Matthew and Luke. The idea that my friend had is that part of what is attributed to Q should actually be attributed to the Gospels of Marcion, Peter, and James, and I have heard others say maybe Thomas as well. His idea is that Matthew and Luke tamed the narratives of Peter and James. He also viewed Luke as directly using Marcion's Gospel instead of there being a common source for both of them, something I am more agnostic about as I've not had a chance to look into this as much as I'd like to, so I'm wondering if this idea had any weight to it. Well, the idea that canonical Luke is based on Marcion's Gospel versus canonical Luke and Marcion both used a shorter Gospel. And that's hard to decide, but it seems like it may be just multiplying hypotheses to say that there was some proto-Luke that both of them used, when given the polemical context, the way Marcion seems to be in Luke's sights, that implies to me that, yeah, he's using the Marcionite Gospel. I believe Joseph Tyson, who wrote a terrific book on this, and I can't think of the title. I can see it right across the room, but not the spelling, the lettering. I remember in person at the Jesus Seminar him mentioning once that he thought there was a proto-Luke that both of them used, but by the time he wrote this book, he had decided, no, Luke is using the Marcionite Gospel, which I think is more likely as well. And now that still leaves the question of who wrote the thing, but that you're not asking that. And there is this interesting book now about Marcion and the date of the Synoptic Gospels that deals with this and says that it is earlier, if I believe. I've not read the whole thing yet. So there's certainly a real case to be argued there. As to the Gospel of Peter as a source of the Synoptics, John Dominic Crossan made a similar argument, a little more nuanced, in his really fascinating book, The Cross That Spoke. He says that the Gospel of Peter preserves a testimony book. Rendell Harris and others posited this long ago, that there must have been collections of Old Testament passages that Christians felt predicted Jesus, and they would make a kind of digest of these things to refer to and debate and so on, which seems kind of likely to me. And that there was what Crossan calls the Cross Gospel, which organized a bunch of these and built a crucifixion account based closely on them. You find some of the same materials in the Epistle of Barnabas and elsewhere. And he said that it looks as if this cross gospel was known to the canonical evangelists, who took various bits and pieces of it for their own narratives. And then he says, our present Gospel of Peter, which of course is just a fragment, but it's like a part of the Passion narrative, that author had access to the original Cross Gospel and the canonical Gospels, and padded the one out with the others. and that sounds kind of over subtle maybe, but read the book. He has a pretty interesting, plausible, I think, argument for this. It's really, really intriguing. And so he says this is a way of explaining why it sure sounds like that the Gospel of Peter is dependent on the canonical Gospels, because it is, and yet it appears to preserve in a fuller form a source used by those evangelists. That's it's a little complex, but reality often is, and that does at least explain an awful lot of things, including not just the similarities to the canonical Gospels, but some of the material they don't have, but that other early Christian texts do. And so that's not exactly saying Peter is earlier than the Synoptics, but it's pretty darn close. By James, I assume you mean the so-called proto-gospel or proto-evangelion of James, which I think we ought to just call the Infancy Gospel of James. I'm gathering your friend believes that Matthew and Luke both drew on that for details. It's possible. I don't know. I'm not sure how probable it is, but it does seem to. I think there are a couple of places in James where it looks like you might have a fuller version of something alluded to in Luke, especially. But it seems a little less likely than the cross gospel thing to me, but it's worth pursuing, and maybe a solution like Crossan's would do the trick. I remember at the Jesus Seminar once, Bruce Chilton was just kind of ridiculing Crossan's theory, and said that he was once staying for the weekend with a friend, and the guest bathroom had towels from all sorts of motels the host had visited. There's the Holiday Inn, there's the Marriott, and so forth. And Chilton said that this is kind of a gag, right? That you're away and staying with friends, well, it's like being in a motel. In fact, it's like being in several motels. The guy had obviously lifted these towels when he had stayed there. Now, Chilton's, oh boy, there's Commissioner Gordon again. Just a second. Okay, Chilton said that, he asked, what's more probable, that representatives from Marriott and Holiday Inn and all these different places had come to this man's house, and each saw a towel that he liked, and they decided to copy it in their own motel and hotel towels, and that there was no overlap. Each took a particular one. Or isn't it more likely that the guy lifted the towels from a bunch of motels? And he said, in the same way, if you see all of this stuff that parallels the canonical Gospels in a Gospel, the Gospel of Peter, why don't you just admit that all the details came from the canonical Gospels? And interesting, though, that isn't quite fair, because Crossan does account for that. He says, well, yeah, there are things that have been lifted from the Gospels, but it's a complex process of how sources were used. I mean, that much is certainly true. Whether he's gotten the goods on what happened in this particular case, I mean, who the heck knows there? But it's fascinating, and I heartily recommend that book. Okay. How about one from Randall M.? I found your takes on the human, all too human development of the Christian scriptures fascinating. My question is if or how much you think the Masoretic text may have been edited in response to Christian doctrine. You've spoken before about how the Septuagint preserves more relics of ancient polytheism, so it may be that editors wanted to fix it anyway. But my curiosity was piqued by a chart at the website The Orthodox Life, showing how, at least in some instances, the intentional correspondence of New Testament passages with Old Testament passages from the Septuagint was cut off in the Masoretic text. Were the Masoretes trying to kill two birds with one stone, presenting the new orthodoxy within Judaism and guarding the community from Christianity? It seems like a theological boxing match with which Christian writers, a boxing match with Christian writers or editors claiming continuity with older scriptures, and Jewish writers and editors denying that continuity. I looked at the chart, and it's done by Eastern Orthodox Christians who I think are just trying to plead on behalf of their hometown boy, the home team, the Greek Septuagint, which was canonical in Orthodoxy. And the person that put together the site believes what Justin Martyr said in the dialogue with Trypho, that there are prophecies about Jesus in the original text preserved in the Septuagint that no longer appear in the Hebrew Scriptures because they've been cut out. This is a standard polemical tactic in the ancient world, because you find the same thing with Tertullian and others claiming that Marcion had cut stuff out of the Gospel of Luke and the various epistles of Paul because the stuff didn't agree with their theology, whereas it seems more likely that it was just the reverse, that the Orthodox, quote-unquote, had padded out these texts in order to sanitize them for the use of the emerging Catholic Church. So having done that, they then said, oh, you don't have these passages? Well, must be because you cut them out. The same thing in the Quran. Right, there's this great book I think I mentioned recently by Robert J. Miller called Helping Jesus Fulfill Prophecy, and he deals in an appendix with the Muslim claim that the New Testament predicts Muhammad, but that those sneaky Christians have altered the text so we no longer read it that way. Of course, that's flat out impossible because we have actual copies, like the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, and I think Alexandrinus too, that are the actual pieces of paper we have are earlier than the foundation of Islam. So, so much for that. But that just reinforces my point that claims like this are trying to they're engaging in projection. It's really they're accusing their opponents of doing the opposite of what they actually did. I think that's what's happened, and there are, I think, about 5 of these where they say, well, looks like the Masoretes have censored the text, and one is the Parthenos, the virgin shall conceive. Parthenos in the Septuagint of Isaiah 7:14, which supposedly meant specifically an intact virgin. I know not a man. Whereas the Hebrew, as we read it in the Masoretic text, has an alma shall conceive, which means a young woman of marriageable age. Could be a virgin, might not be. That isn't really the point they're getting at there, just age. And so this person, the maker of the chart, said, aha, it looks like they did change the word to avoid a prediction of the virgin birth. Come on. The Dead Sea Scrolls, I believe, in Isaiah, there are like 3 copies of Isaiah in there. They have Alma, and again, those actual copies are earlier than Justin Martyr. Plus the fact that it's now up for grabs as to whether Parthenos had to mean strictly virgin. It may well have had the same range of meaning that Alma did. Jane Shaberg did some interesting discussion of that in her book, The Illegitimacy of Jesus. Another one was, there were a couple of obscure ones from Isaiah, and it just seems to me like this is special pleading, and if you were going to have the Masoretes trying to eliminate messianic prophecies of Jesus, they picked some pretty piddling examples, if they are examples. So I don't buy that at all. The fact is that there were just different types of text in the ancient world. The Samaritan Pentateuch is a bit different at certain points from the Dead Sea Scrolls text, which is a bit different from the whatever the basic text was that the Masoretes used, and different again from what the Septuagint translators used. It had diverged much earlier, and so I think that's really kind of it's like George Lambsa, who 80 years ago used to argue that the whole Bible was originally written in Aramaic. No accident that he belonged to the Assyrian Nestorian church, where they all spoke Aramaic. It's just, we're lucky the Catholic Church didn't claim that the Bible was originally written in Latin. They didn't have to, though, because though they admitted it was a translation, they said it was inspired and it was the normative version anyway. But anyhow, then Randall also says, why do most English Bible translations, why are they based on the Masoretic text? Don't modern editors see the pattern of the changes? I don't think there is a pattern to those changes, as I've just said. And the Revised Standard Version, for instance, right out of the box did incorporate the Septuagint and various others, because if you notice in the footnotes in the Old Testament, it will often say, we're going with the reading preserved in the Septuagint or even the Vulgate or other ancient versions that they figure have preserved the original very frequently, actually. So I don't think it really is true. There are a couple of holdouts from the old days, like the King James and the New King James and so on, that stick with the Masoretic. The Jewish Study Bible goes with the Masoretic text, but zealously gives you the variants in these marginal notes. They're not lazy about it. They realize that the Masoretic text doesn't give you the original all the time, but they figure, what the heck? Let's bring the reader through the process that critical scholars have gone through. Here's the text we've always had, and here's the bunch of changes that probably are needed. So I don't think it's as bad as this Eastern Orthodox site says. Again, I think it's special pleading. This one is from Caden Fox in Ohio. I'm working on a lecture as part of a story I'm writing on the Book of John. While not thinking too hard about the fascinating fact that Jesus' mother is never mentioned by name, I came across a video on supernormal stimuli as they pertain to Jessica Rabbit and the Venus of Willendorf. This video made the claim that IMRI or fMRI, it looks a little odd, studies showed that the brain parts used to recognize people light up when men and women were shown pictures of men, but that the brain parts used to recognize objects, as well as the ones used to recognize people, lit up when people were shown pictures of women. And this happened in both male and female subjects, so it's not an inherent sexism. That being said, several decades ago there was a similar study on sounds, where ethnic Japanese individuals in Japan processed natural sounds with the language parts of their brain, but Japanese Americans processed natural sounds as noise, not communication. Reading Julian Jaynes's magnum opus, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, made me wonder if the author of John wasn't trying to hide a goddess figure, but rather trying to de-objectify her by keeping all portrayals minimalistic, including the obscuring of a name, similar to how Allah cannot be portrayed. The alternative would be something like Hera, the cow-eyed one, or indeed how Mary Magdalene conjures forth the image of a redhead, where try as we might to see the goddess as superhuman, we keep reducing the goddess the way we reduce all females despite our best intentions to a collection of parts, and identify her by way of synecdoche as an eye or a hair color rather than as a complete human. If this is the case, it would have to be an on top of rather than an instead of the natural solution you must enact when you keep Jesus as the same person throughout the Osiris to Horus transformation. To avoid Jesus being wed to his own mother, Magdalene has to be somewhat different than the wife of Joseph. Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm not sure you need to bring Julian Jaynes into the equation. And another caution is that John also does not name the brothers of Jesus, whom he does mention, just not by name. It's quite possible that there is a polemical edge to it, that he doesn't want to name people who are considered to be leaders of a particular faction of Christianity. He wants them in the story, and especially the brothers, because he makes them villains, basically. But I'm not sure about I can't imagine they would even have the idea of de-objectifying in mind. But I would suggest that the parts business with women has to do with sociobiology. Why is it that men find the female anatomy attractive? It's what is the big deal with the breasts and the behind and the hips, right? What's the big deal there? And, I mean, you could be like St. Augustine and figure there's no real attraction, or if there is, it means you're a degenerate sinner. Well, of course, the reason for that is that, though they don't even know it, men are looking for good mothers for their offspring, and large breasts imply good nursing. Wide hips imply successful childbirth. Now, they don't realize that. Just like the sexual urge, as Aquinas and Aristotle realized, is put there by evolution, right, to promote propagation of the race. Now, we mystify that, and I'm not criticizing it. It reminds me of this alien woman said to Captain Kirk, why does your species make such a big deal of romance? Well, we do, and that's great. Part of the glory of humanity. But the whole... I remember Carol and I, when Victoria had just been born, she was a little baby in her carry-all thing, and we went out to a restaurant on a trip back to New Jersey with a couple of friends from our church, and there were a lot of young people in the place, couples, and our friend Becky Reddington said, it's funny that these guys dancing with these gals and so on, what they're seeking, though they may not realize it, is what Carol already has. The whole sexual attraction and lust is there to get the human race propagated. These guys don't seem to understand that, but that's why they're Lotharios, right? And, of course, they're going to try to derail that, right, with birth control and so forth. And I'm not saying they shouldn't, right? Don't get me wrong. But that's why there is this instinct. Without it, no human race. So those who happen to have these instincts through random mutation wound up dominating the race for obvious reasons, and thus we have sexualized human race. I think that's what's going on with the objectification. You're checking out the merchandise for reproductive reasons. And now, why do women see it that way? Well, because they're part of the same competition. They want to be able to compete for a mate. Again, this is not conscious. It's more deeply seated than that. Now, what you mentioned about Mary Magdalene, I find also very interesting, because I think that Barbara Walker is probably right in her just endlessly fascinating articles on Jesus and Mary Magdalene in her great book, The Women's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets, I think it is, where she says that originally in the Jesus myth, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus, were the same goddess figure. But they, because the rabbis still knew that, because they referred to Jesus' mother as a prostitute and a hairdresser, which is the same thing, the madam of a brothel. And that, which means they were identifying Mary, the mother of Jesus, with Mary Magdalene. Christians would say they were confusing the two, but I think Walker may well be right that they remembered that they were originally the same character in the myth, which does fit the prototype of these, or the stereotype of these other savior gods. Let's see. Well, I got to get on to working on Holy Fable, but I'm pleased to have spent some time with you here on St. Paddy's Day. And I hope you might see your way to donating to the Pay the Darn Bills Fund around here in County Price. It's actually I am part Irish, part Scottish, and part Welsh. Price is a Welsh name, at least sometimes. Our name Price was originally Ap-Rhys, A-P-R-H-Y-S, the son of Rhys, which becomes Price. But I don't think there's a day for Welsh saints, so I'll stick with the Irish. Well, if you can help out, we'd appreciate it, but in any event, I'll be looking forward to seeing you next time on the next exciting episode of the Bible Geek.